Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you all to the Energy Transition Dialogue's 2-minute warning interview. And this week, I'm delighted to be joined by Mr. Hemant Chowdhry, founder and managing director of the Circular Economy Alliance Australia. Hemant, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Diala, for having me on this show.
Of course, Hemant, there's a lot of talk about the circular economy, lots of initiatives being taken both on sort of local, regional and international levels. And of course, this is just one solution towards the climate change goals that countries and even companies have set themselves. So just let's start by asking you a generic question of, how much progress do you think we've made so far on circular economy principles? Is there enough understanding out there on what this solution provides?
Look, if you just talk about the term, yes, more people know about the term circular economy today than what would be the case maybe 5 or 7 years ago. Certainly, there are a lot of talks, a lot of seminars, a lot of conferences, a lot of organizations, perhaps set up in the last 5 years, who are promoting the whole domain, the discussion, the agenda of circular economy. But if you ask me the progress, I think the progress is painfully slow. I would not call it backwards, but it is slow. And the reason for that is we haven't done enough work in demystifying circular economy and keeping it simple, real and relevant to the community as at large. So I think there is a lot of work that needs to happen in that space, because
let me just take you up on that point you made, keeping it simple and keeping it to the community, because I've talked to a few people on this topic, and quite a few of them have made that point of, we're trying in some cases to be too big picture, too general and too wide, and actually circular economy works best literally in a local setting. We had somebody on the program once from Brazil, and they kept talking about we must just work on our in-country initiatives. So are we being distracted? Because of course your alliance, the group that you are running, is all about conversations across the world, right? So where should we be focusing? Should we be not doing that and really focusing on individual localized solutions?
I think I would say both, because you need to have both top-down and bottom-up approach here. But we have to realize that for circular economy transition, the actions that are made by an individual at his or her level are going to be very important. So it is very much a social reengineering sort of movement. And I actually use the term more and more nowadays. I call it a movement, circular economy movement, because it is about the choices we make as a consumer, as a user, the choices we make in terms of how we take, make, use, and dispose material and products and use services. So to some extent, those individual choices are crucial. But then to make those choices, to enable the community at large to make those choices and make those better choices, that requires work in a number of areas, and especially in the areas of policy, education, technology, governance, systems, and even market instruments. So to some extent, is one of those things where, yes, we have to make those choices in the way we consume, manage, discard, reuse our resources. But at the same time, to make those choices properly and make the right choices, we have to look at the entire system.
Yeah,
and ensure that the system is broadly.
So let's talk about one of those that you mentioned, which is policy, right? Government. I mean, municipality, let's say, and up to national government. would you identify any low-hanging fruits where policies can today, tomorrow, make changes? We can see changes in policy that would be obvious ones to make to increase the awareness, to increase action on this point.
Yeah, absolutely. If you start with the government, yeah, the first thing I would push the government to do would be to truly enforce and implement the polluter pays principle. Start to put price on pollution. That is one of the major game changers and incentives you need to put in place. And obviously, you cannot just say polluter pays. I go a step further and say producer pays. That's where we have to start introducing mandatory extended producer responsibility schemes, and I think the world will see that. I mean, when we talk about carbon tax, that is one way of actually introducing the polluter pays principle. But if you look at circular economy, and that's not just about climate change is major part of it, and circular economy from all accounts can contribute up to 50% reduction in our emissions by looking at the entire value chain and how we minimize the carbon emissions throughout the value chain. But this circular economy is not just about carbon footprint. It's also about resources. It's also about getting the most value out of our resources and keeping the resources in circularity. We, from all accounts, only return 6 or 7% of what we currently extract back into the value chain. So there is this huge 93% gap. Now, this is where I think the movement has to go. And when we talk about a resource, it is not just about material in terms of like extracted material. It's also about water. Yeah. It's about water resources and food and all those things. So any intervention really at any level, that contributes towards either extending the life of the resource or keep it in circularity is, in my eyes, circular economy.
I mean, in this part of the world where I'm based, in the Middle East and the Gulf, of course, water is very scarce, and we rely a lot on desalinated water. And of course, agriculture is also scarce here, and not one of the main, obviously, products of the Gulf, at least. And there are a lot of local initiatives which are, again, using solutions, creating solutions of how to food, compost, etc., energy, the whole sort of food, water, energy cycle, if you like, which perhaps makes a lot of sense in this part of the world. But a lot of good initiatives being taken. But what would you say, perhaps on the company front now? Okay, as individuals, we can make our own efforts. Companies, do they have the incentives for that? At the end of the day, they need to be doing this for the good of efficiencies. But also, are they convinced that it's working for their bottom line as well? Or again, do we need policies to be subsidizing that or to be favoring that solution?
I think companies can achieve significant benefits by actually truly practicing circular economy. Circular economy is a new term, or relatively new term, coined in the last 10 years. But there are various terms used in the past which capture some aspects of circular economy, things like cleaner production, waste minimization, pollution prevention, eco-efficiency, resource efficiency. All these terms have been coined and used in the last 30, 40 years. We implemented a cleaner production program in the state of South Australia, where I'm based. And this was done in the 90s. And we had close to 48 industries from 18 different industry sectors participate in that program. And we provided technical and financial assistance to participating industries. The focus was on prevention and minimization of waste. So looking at energy efficiency, water efficiency, waste minimization, improved, housekeeping and material management and inventory management. After 3 years of the program, we had a the university do an independent economic evaluation of the program. And for every dollar that was invested into that program by us, the return on investment for the participating industries was $32.3. So, can you imagine the net benefit? So I think we spent close to $2.2 million on that program. And I think the cumulative economic environmental benefit was close to $80 million. So there are significant benefits for participants. And I think industry gets it, but when it comes to understanding it at a conceptual and a theoretical level, yes, I think mostly industries get it. The why part perhaps is getting more understood. The how part is where we need to focus a lot of our efforts on.
Well, I mean, the how part, of course, has a lot to do with technology. And are we sort of seeing that even, I mean, technology is obviously continuously in formation and R&D, but even with what exists out there today, are stakeholders in the circular economy leveraging what's out there enough? I mean, is it obvious what solutions are there, and are they being leveraged? And if not, why not?
I think, in my humble opinion, when it comes to circular economy and the benefits that the world can derive through that transition, we are scratching the tip of the iceberg. There's enormous potential. I was reading a book the other day, which is an old publication in the 80s. It was called Factor 4. And Factor 4 was about, that book used a number of examples from a diversity of sectors like construction, transport, agriculture, mining, and all those various sectors. And it claimed that humanity as a whole, we can have same quality of life that we currently enjoy for 1/4 our material and energy intensity. And this was written in the 80s. So it's not new thing that we are claiming here. It's possible. There are lots and lots of low-hanging fruit, but I don't think there are enough incentives, and those incentives have to be created by policy, regulatory, economic sort of measures. There are not enough incentives for them to really look at their entire operation and their entire value chain, to identify better practices, better solutions. And not every time technology is the solution. Prevention is a very integral part of this, and we tend to focus a lot on the problem when it has already occurred, and that's seen everywhere in the world. It's not just a phenomena that we see common to a particular, whether it's Western world or sort of developed world or sort of developing countries. It's something that we notice quite often, is that there is not enough work done on the prevention. So,
I mean, for example, we work a lot with the energy sector as consultants, and one of the part of that sector obviously is petrochemicals, and of course that's the subsector that produces plastics. Plastics is always, at least from a public relations point of view, the big baddie out there. But actually, a lot of energy companies who have petchem products say, well, listen, we're producing environmentally friendly, new, clean plastic. The problem is in the disposal. And of course, when it comes to disposal, it's to do with consumers like us and companies to an extent. And with that, of course, you're back to policy, because how do you then, entice and penalize the disposal of plastic? Still a huge problem in the world. And yet we're not getting there. The message doesn't, I mean, it's getting through. There's clearly initiatives from, school level up to company level. But what do you think is the solution to this problem? Plastics aren't going away. They're in everything that we use, all the consumer products that we're all addicted to. What is the solution to this distribution and disposal of plastics that we haven't managed to get yet?
That's a great question. And I always say that waste is a resource at a wrong place. So plastic, if it is properly captured and segregated, captured and repurposed or recycled, reused, it is a resource. When it goes into the environment, then it becomes a problem. It becomes a pollution issue. I won't name the organization, but I had very interesting conversation with one of the chief executives of a large packaging group. And they told me that they spent close to $500 million, if not more, on improving the recyclability of their packaging. And so they've spent a lot of money on technology, on products and new sort of packaging material and stuff like that. But they said that nearly 85% of that packaging, which is technically recyclable, still ends into the ocean, waterways, or in landfills. So you are spending this whole amount of money, but you're not getting the impact. You're not getting the results. It's just literally going down the drain. And I think I was reading somewhere close to $150 billion worth of plastic currently in value terms, goes into the oceans. So it's a huge number. But the challenge is, you're right. You rightly said, is I call it what we are facing more and more is the fact that yes, there are a lot of people doing a lot of work out of their commitment towards this issue with plastics and other environmental issues. The impacts are isolated. Because there's no, we need to move from what I call isolated impact to collective impact. And that requires a far better multi-sectoral collaboration, which is not happening. So there's disconnect.
What would it take to make that happening across, as you said, across sectors? It's all about the coordination across sectors. We talked about the energy, food, water connection, particularly in this in this part of the world. The financial incentives, we've discussed, those are there. There's obvious benefits to doing this. There's savings to be had. So is it just a matter of time, or do we need to have we've seen, you mentioned the carbon tax at the beginning of our conversation. We're not even there yet with the carbon tax, and that's being talked about for years, if not decades, in terms of getting global initiative on that. Waste tax, let's talk about that, whether it's at the municipality level or national level. Does the government need to be putting more stringent penalties on consumers and companies to hold them accountable of how they're getting rid of their waste? Is that one solution that could work?
It is obviously it's an obvious solution. Absolutely. I think I would not say that. I would not use the word penalties. I think I would perhaps use pretty robust framework, policy framework, which obviously has to be implemented and regulated. But I think there is a need for that. I mean, even where I'm based in South Australia, we started in 1992-93. We introduced a $5 a ton levy on waste to landfill, and it was not very popular measure at that time. It was seen as a bit of a tax collection exercise, but the intention was that half of that $5 per ton, half of that money would go towards better enforcement, and half of that would go towards giving more incentives, and creating so education and incentive programs. What started at $5 a ton in 92-93 is now $145 a ton in 30 years or more than that. And what has it done? It has really helped. It has kind of provided a very strong foundation for community, for incentive programs, for community education programs, but also it has brought in the solution providers into the market. Because if I am someone who has a technology for recycling plastic or making plastic into a product, recycle plastic into a product, I already have an ability to go to the government and say, look, instead of paying $145 a ton to take it to landfill, maybe I could take it at a slightly discount. I could take it for $100 a ton as a gate fee, and I can then create value out of that product, out of that waste, and I got a very viable business model because and then also you close the loop by also mandating your procurement policies, with the government, and so that you increase the content. You have more. Sustainable procurement becomes part of encouraging that as well. So the whole industry can be sustained, nurtured, and developed by those measures. So I will always very strongly advocate those things, a policy framework and proper sort of levies and charges.
Yeah.
But that is not enough. Sorry,
That's-
that is not enough. I think it has to be backed up with education. It has to be backed up with community partnership, and the right kind of research and technologies as well. So it's not just one piece of the jigsaw. We have to look at the entire picture.
Absolutely, and we do see a lot of initiatives on the local front as in education, as you said, starting. I was talking to a gentleman from the energy sector recently, and he was actually not complaining, but he was making the point that the new generation and even the one before that, have grown up thinking the energy sector is a dirty industry, and they're never told about the clean side of it and what it's doing, and what it's trying to do, and so it has a big PR problem. And it's trying to educate, as you said, these youngsters who are collecting plastic bottles and doing these from the time they walk now. So that's all coming into the conversation. But Hannah, but just before we run out of time, let's look a little bit more at this year's COP27 that's coming up in November. It's actually being held here in the region in Egypt. And of course, we just had our COP26 meeting in Glasgow in 2021. Is the circular economy conversation a big enough part of that big COP gathering, do you think? Or are we focusing too much on old world problems, such as, the energy industry is a polluter? They weren't even invited to COP26, which is probably a big mistake. But how can circular economy advocates, get a better seat at the table at meetings like this? And do they have that?
At the moment, I don't think we get enough say or representation, because I think a lot of these deliberations are actually focusing on a very narrow prism. It's a very narrow prism. You cannot just put everything under net zero and just sort of assume that is the only way to deal with the problem. You got to be looking at prevention. You got to be looking at the value chain, the supply chain. You still, when you talk about net zero, we are still talking about scope 1 and scope 2 emissions mostly. What about the scope 3 emissions?
Yeah.
I think those are, and there are a lot of interesting reports out there, and which claim that up to 50% of your commitments for greenhouse reduction would have to come from circular economy approach and interventions. So you have to have more emphasis given on not just looking at greenhouse gas issues in isolation, but more emphasis given to the entire aspect of our consumption, our the whole process of take, make, use, dispose, and currently the linear economy model, which we all can now see we have reached the point where it's causing serious issues. I mean, we talk, forget about just the climate change part. We are reaching the planetary boundaries. We are already reaching the finite limits of material extraction. We were 27 billion tons in 1970 per annum in terms of the annual extraction of material. We crossed 100 billion tons last year. So it's 3.7 times increase in our what we are extracting, and not very little is coming back into value chain, and this cannot sustain itself. I mean, this is a sure shot. It's only a one way. I say, this is, if there are people who are talking about circular economy, I use the analogy that it's like we are standing on the top of Titanic and shouting that, look, there's an iceberg ahead, and they got a very feeble voice at the moment. It's not being heard. It's not being understood very well that this is not just about climate change. It's about those critical elements and materials which constitute our current way of life and quality of life. And what do we do? I mean, when there is we are already reaching the limit, and when we reach the end point, do we have a substitute? Do we have other ways of dealing with this issue? So there are some fundamental discussions that need to be had. You cannot just, there's an elephant in the room, and we just cannot not ignore it.
Well, Mr. Hemant Chowdhury, founder and MD of Circular Economy Alliance Australia, thank you so much for your insight today and for your warnings, I should say, as well, and what we should be doing. And that's a very good point that you made on the scope 3, the value chain, and you know, let's start at the beginning, if you like, and try and be preventative rather than just focus on the solutions and technology after. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.